Welcome everyone to episode 2 of ChordCast. Today we're still here with me. I'm Lucy, a co-president of CMC.
And I'm Andy, the other co-president of CMC.
And we're just excited that you're joining us on ChordCast to learn more about the experiences of professional musicians.
Today, our guest is Greg Simon, who is a composer and jazz trumpeter and the Associate Professor of Composition and Jazz Studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He teaches at the Brevard Music Center, and his works have been performed by ensembles and performers around the world. Let's welcome Dr. Simon. Would you like to introduce yourself before we begin?
Yeah, hi. Hi, Andy. Hi, Lucy. Hi, Internet. Really glad to be here. Really glad to speak with you guys. Yeah, let's dive in. Let's get into it.
All right, cool. So our first batch of questions are kind of about your career in composition and also personal philosophy. So
Sure.
As a classical composer and a jazz trumpeter, how would you say your exposure between these two worlds influence how you compose and perform? And how do you fundamentally think about music?
Oh man. That's the first question? Wow. Okay. Let's see. Well, so for me, the two have always been linked. There's never been a time for me, I don't think anyway, that I was a classical composer without being a jazz trumpeter. And there's never been a time where I was a real jazz trumpeter without being a classical composer. I kind of got to both late. I was a typical music student. I did public school music and band and things like that. And that was kind of where I got my first exposure to performance. And then later on, I got my first exposure to jazz. And I didn't really start studying jazz seriously until late high school. And it's just, maybe it's coincidental, maybe it's not, that's about the same time that I also started really writing music seriously. So like from the earliest start of my career, they were always sort of linked and cross-pollinative and symbiotic. But they were never the same. Like I never really considered myself to be a great classical trumpet player. And I never really considered myself to be a great jazz composer. Still when I spend a tremendous amount of time with big band music now, and still when I write for big band, I feel very uncomfortable. I don't feel like I really understand how to manage jazz force as well as a composer. And to me, that's okay. That is something that I'm always sort of trying to work on. And increasingly, that's something that I'm interested in sort of exploring a little more. But when I am writing music, I think more what I'm interested in is, rather than capturing the style of jazz, which is one of the reasons, not the only reason by any means, but one of the reasons to work with jazz musicians or compose in a jazz context. I think rather than capturing the jazz parts of jazz, as it were, what I'm really interested in doing compositionally is taking the creative process that informs the way that I improvise and figuring out how it plays out when I am writing concert music. And, Andy has heard me give this spiel on this already because he was my student at Brevard. But when you're talking about jazz improvisation, in my opinion, what you're really talking about is a certain way of thinking about improvisation, one that's sort of born of open-mindedness and vulnerability to other people's ideas, the ability to be redirected by other members of the ensemble, shaped by other members of the ensemble, and the ability to shape those people's ideas yourself. That creative process, I think, at its core, is the way that I'm thinking about composition. And my music may or may not at any given moment sound jazzy. It may or may not come out of the jazz world, because there's a lot of other musics that are constituent parts of me and the way I think musically. But I think the thing that my improvisation and my composition share is that thing, that creative process, or that approach to the creative process, and how ideas can interact and be influenced by one another. So I don't know if that answers the question or not, but it's as good a starting point as any, I think.
Yeah, that works. This question wasn't in the script, but I'm gonna say it anyways.
Okay, let's hear it.
So you mentioned that you got to both composition and jazz in like kind of a later period in your life than most. Could you give like an outline of your life and your education process towards that point that where you are now?
Yeah, absolutely. So how far back do you want me to go? Like baby Greg or slightly after that?
Slightly after that.
Slightly after
I
that.
guess.
So I did most of my growing up in the Bay Area of California, specifically in Pleasanton, which is a city in the East Bay. When I was 12, my family moved to Oregon, specifically Corvallis, the home of Oregon State. Go Beavers. I had started doing music basically in elementary school, and I was one of those kids, like I think many professional musicians are. I was a kid who kind of right out of the gate just sort of got it, like I didn't need a tremendous amount of coaching to be good at music. And initially that was the thing that kept me with it. I was not a super popular kid. But I could do music. And so that was the kind that was my social currency. And that was what sort of got me initially into it. And then of course, as happens, you fall in love with it. And especially the thing that got me really to fall in love with it was when I could make it my own, when I could use it to improvise, when I could use it to compose. And like I said, that came a little later. That came in middle school. And like late middle school, early high school is when I started thinking about music as something that could be creative. And then by the time I got to college, and I went to the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington for my first degree. By the time I got there, I was interested in studying both seriously. And I started at Puget Sound as a music ed major because I think like a lot of people, I was a little afraid of failing. And not being able to pay my bills. So I was like, well, I'm going to have the music ed degree and, have a social safety net. And I just realized really quickly, as I think a lot of people do, that if you're really giving a music ed degree what it deserves in terms of your time and energies and attention, you don't have time to reach the highest levels of performance, composition, etc. There's just no way. Music educators work too hard. So by sophomore year, I was out of that and I ended up getting a BA in music instead, because that was the degree that gave me the most flexibility to keep doing the things that I wanted to do. I went on to get a master's from the University of Colorado in composition. And while I was there, I was really active in the composition program, of course, but I also took a lot of lessons with Brad Good, who teaches trumpet there. I was able to take 1 or 2 classes in jazz. I was able to play with the jazz ensembles at the university. But the other thing that I would do is after the day was done and after I'd written my music, I was a night owl back then. So I was usually writing like right after dinner, like 8:30 to 10 or so. And really often, like right after that, I would go to a late night jam session in Denver. At the time, there was a jam session on Tuesday, a really great one at a club called Dazzle that ran, I think, like 10 to 1. And then an after hours jam session at a place called Herbs that ran, I think, 12:30 to 2:30. So often I would get done with composing and I would run up to the jam session with my horn and I would see some of the best players in the world just, throw down on a couple of tunes, and I would get up there and I would try to hang with them. I would try to be on their level. And by the time I got done at Colorado, I had learned a lot about what my own priorities were, but I'd really learned a lot about the horn and about the language and about what I wanted out of my musical career. When I finished my master's, I took some time off. I think I was a little burned out on school, which I think we all get, and some of us soldier on through all 3 degrees, the bachelor's, master's, and the doctorate. And I I have all the respect in the world for those people. I was not able to do that. I was really burned out. I was ready for some time away from the need to compose, the compulsion to compose for a degree program. I was ready for some time where I could sort of define my own destiny musically, get involved with the projects that excited me, whether they be as a player or a composer. And I was lucky. I graduated and immediately was able to find some work as a teacher. Colorado kept me on as a member of their teaching staff. I taught adjunct with them. I also concurrently taught at Metro State College in Denver. So I was already spending a lot of time in the city because I had made so many friends and musical connections there. So I was able to hang out in the Denver area for a couple of years and just be myself. And I wrote a little music, got involved with a couple of projects here and there. I played a lot, and a lot of the playing that I ended up doing was not what I had studied in jazz school. A lot of the gigs that I was getting at the time were pops gigs. They were requiring me to know the horn lines to all the Michael Jackson tunes, all the Stevie Wonder tunes, and a lot of those gigs work off book. You don't have sheet music in front of you, so that was a totally different kind of education. Taking some of these gigs, showing up, and having the singer be like, hey, we're going to do Superstition in F sharp, and every member of the horn section knows that line and knows it well enough to transpose it up and down the chromatic scale. In order to be a part of that scene, you have to be at that level, and you have to have that depth of knowledge that exists beyond the classical canon. So it took me a while, I think, when I first started freelancing in that area, to just get to the point where I was musically on the level that I needed to be. But that very thing meant that by the time I left Colorado a couple years later, I was a very different musician, and I had a very different sound and a very different conception of the music that I wanted to write and the role that it played in the world. And that was sort of the ethos that I took with me to the University of Michigan, which was just where I sort of kept growing. I had a tremendous number of great mentors that took an interest in my education, not only my composition teachers, Christy Custer and Evan Chambers and Michael Doherty, but also Ellen Rowe in the jazz department, taught me a tremendous amount about music and leadership and creativity. So did Ed Sareth, and Bill Lucas, who was my trumpet teacher, basically completely reshaped the way that I thought the instrument, or that I thought about the instrument. So when I graduated from Michigan, I got on the academic job market, and as many people do, I had to wait a little bit for my job to come open, but I did, and that brought me to the University of Nebraska in 2016. And as of this record, I am freshly tenured, so I'm gonna be hanging around here for a while. So yeah, that's my professional educational background, such as it is. We're like 15 minutes into the record time now, but yeah, that's my story.
That's awesome. I think it's really helpful for other people, like aspiring musicians watching this podcast, just to hear an example of what like a professional music education path might be like. So
Yeah.
hearing that.
Good. I mean, for what it's worth, and I'm sure we'll get into this more as we go on, but I don't think there's a right path. There may have been at one point, but I think about not only my path, but the paths of most of the professional musicians that I know at this point. And for the most part, the people who are really doing, I think, exciting stuff, all of their paths are very circuitous and take some weird, surprising sort of turns. I think the big lesson that I came away from my path with was make friends and keep friends. Because they, I think, more than anything, shaped my path. And of course, that means a couple of different things in various different contexts. It means, of course, all the things that friendship means, being a good person and being at the very least not insufferable to be around. But it also means, like, when you get a gig, show up on time, know the music, don't let people down. When you commit to a deadline, meet it. When you are given criticism, receive it gracefully. You know, like these sorts of things, I think more than anything, not necessarily defined any moment of my career, but they made sure that a lot of doors were available and open for me to walk through when I needed to walk through them.
That makes sense.
So, yeah.
Which composers or other concepts do you often take inspiration from?
Ooh, this is a big question. Which composers or other things, other concepts do I take inspiration from? For me, everything is narrative. The way I think about music as an expressive form, as a cultural artifact, as a mode of communication, for me, it all boils down to narrative. So my favorite thing in the world to study is narrative theory. And for a while, I was really into the work of Joseph Campbell, who is the sort of, how would you describe him? He codified for more or less the first time the monomyth, or the hero's journey, which has been a really important sort of narrative structure for understanding the way we as humans tell stories. Increasingly, I'm getting into the work of Rick Altman and Hayden White and Roland Barthes, and their sort of ideas about how narrative works and how we perceive it and things like that. From a musical standpoint, my favorite composers, it's hard to say. It feels like the answer to that question changes every 5 minutes, you know? But like at this moment, when I'm thinking about the people who like I am really, really excited for whatever their next project is going to be, a couple different people come to mind. The first is Miho Hazama, who is a band leader, composer out in New York. Writes for big band primarily, but does a couple of other sort of non-big band projects as well. Extremely creative, an amazing spirit in her music. Just really, really wonderful all the way around. Another person who comes to mind, who I always find their work just really, really, really interesting, is my buddy David Biedenbender, who teaches at Michigan State University, and he and I overlapped for a little bit at the University of Michigan. But the way he thinks about music manifests in these very sort of big and cinematic, without ever being or feeling cliche, these sort of grandiose, earth-shattering musical moments. And they're really, really, really interesting. And he always sort of finds a way to surprise me whenever I listen to his work. So yeah, I'm a big fan of his. And then let's see, other stuff that inspires me. You know, I think if you're like me and you distill your understanding of musical expression to narrative, then you kind of by definition have to be interested in what other narrative forms are doing. And so I read as many books as I can. I play a lot of video games, but I'm sort of mostly interested in video games and books and other media that do interesting things with narrative and ludonarrative and linear narrative. So, you know, like that's one of the reasons I love video games, is because they can do things with non-linear storytelling that I think sort of shape the way I think about linear storytelling. The last thing, one of my favorite authors is Harlan Ellison. And this summer, one of the things that I reread again was his novella, A Boy and His Dog, which hard to talk about because it's a little un-PC and very not safe for work, but it's yeah, that's all stuff that inspires me. And the funny thing about inspiration, I think, is that I don't think anyone would say my music is particularly dark or gory or depressed. And yet, like, a lot of the things that I find inspiration in kind of tend that way. So I don't know. I would have to think, I think a little more about what exactly it is I get from them inspirationally, but I think it ultimately has to do with how they roll, how they share out information with you, what sort of questions they choose to answer or not answer, rather than sort of the content. You know, it's about the form for me less than it is about the function, or the function rather than the form, I suppose. Does that all make sense? Feels like a lot.
Yeah, it's like you're taking inspiration from like different kinds of media and like tell stories.
Yeah.
It was
And
like, sorry.
No. Just to say, yeah, like maybe a better way of saying it is I don't necessarily think about myself as learning from that stuff what kind of stories to tell. I think about it as teaching me how to tell stories. Right. And you can lay any sort of content or spirit on top of that framework that you want. Anyway, yeah, Andy, what were you going to say?
I think you just said what I was going to say. I was going to
right.
say
Sorry.
something something about how like your approach to like inspiration is like how you answered that question was like quite different from what I was expecting. I think like all of it revolves around like the concept of like narrative that like composers are like so willing to capture.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Well, and narrative is like, it's a fraught topic if you're a composer in particular, because I think, like you and I have, I think, talked about this a little bit. When you think narrative as a composer, your sort of innate impulse is to think programmatic music.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily what we're talking about, right? Narrative at heart is, Hayden White would say, it's chronology with meaning. But more to the point, narrative is really more about the way we understand a story more than it is about the story itself that's being told. Right. And to me, that's freeing, because it means the story that is told can be about anything and can involve all sorts of different variations. Like, it's an inexhaustible resource. You know, there's no limit to the number of ways it can be utilized creatively. But ultimately, it doesn't always translate to something programmatic or something that has a prescripted number of twists and turns. Rather, it's about, like, if I'm going to write a piece and I want to elicit in you and Lucy a specific emotional reaction, I can tap into what I know about the way we as human beings respond to these sort of narrative designs, and I can harness that information. And how can I use that to shape the musical decisions I'm making so that I can more reliably get you to those emotional places that I want to?
Okay, so so our next question is going to be about identity and its influence on music. So obviously, identity is one of the major factors that influences the music one writes.
Yeah.
So you mentioned this in Brevard. Part of your identity is Hispanic. You're part Chilean, and like a lot of your pieces reflect this identity. And you've also mentioned in Brevard how you would never say participate in competitions for Hispanic composers, as you don't have the same experiences with bias, etc., as other Hispanic people may have. How else would you say this identity is reflected in the music you write, or how you go about writing music in general, or your broader outlook in life? And if there are other aspects of your identity that you wish to share, you can as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first and foremost, I think that, you know, you kind of hit it on the head. Like, I think two things can be true simultaneously. One, I can identify myself as a Hispanic man, and feel an entitlement to that culture and the use of its history and tradition, and also acknowledge that like I have white skin and an American accent, and as a result have and an anglicized, you know, Jewish name, and as a result have not had to endure any of the hardships that a lot of Hispanic composers do. So that's kind of why I won't apply to Hispanic specific competitions, because generally I think those competitions are designed to amplify voices that need amplifying. I don't consider myself to be one of those voices because I don't read as Hispanic, because my identity has never been a thing that, as far as I know, has been an obstacle to me professionally. But that being said, my Hispanic identity is very important to me. And more to the point, my Chilean identity is very important to me. You know, partially just because it's my mom's identity, and you connect with your history in a way that I think is different for every person, but it's always sort of very intimate and personal. But you know, my mom, the thing that brought her to the United States, the thing that brought her family to the United States, was that she was a political refugee. You know, in 1973, there was a US-backed coup in the country. And that was when a name that you two may have heard of, Augusto Pinochet, came to power. And he was certainly not the only dictator in Latin America's history, but he was one of the most ruthless. And there were a lot of disappearances and a lot of state-sponsored killings. And that's what brought my mom to the States. That's why ultimately I'm here talking to you. And that's a very weird thing. It's a very weird thing to have your existence be the result of a political cataclysm that cost thousands of lives. And so you know, I think about that side of my heritage a lot because of that. And my dad's heritage, he was born in LA, in the LA area, but he was Jewish, or he was Jewish. He no longer practices. But that side of my heritage is very important to me too. But it doesn't, to me, I think, present the same questions about identity that my Chilean heritage does, for a variety of reasons, including, but not limited to, the fact that I am ultimately a white man who tries to identify responsibly with his Hispanic heritage. And it's harder to do that than for me to identify responsibly with my Jewish heritage. You know, as long as we're talking about my Chilean heritage in particular, I can say that the concrete sort of ways that culture manifests in my music are myriad. But maybe the most prominent one is that there is a tremendous tradition of political protest music in Chile, specifically around the years of like 1960 to 1973 or so. It was a very important time for music as a form of political protest. And a lot of my favorite Chilean artists come from that era. And that means not only understanding their music, but that means understanding the role that they played politically, understanding what their political motivation was for making their music, and also understanding when those ends were met and when they were not, because both are true. There are times when musical protest has been an effective form of protest, and there has been a time that it has not. And in Chile, it's been both. And, you know, when I think about the role of music societally, and when I think about the role that I want my music to play in society, it's not by definition political. However, I think it's very hard for culture to exist in a political vacuum. And I aspire, I think, to not necessarily the non-political ends of a lot of my favorite Chilean artists, but I think one of their ways of creating and manifesting political change was through creating community around their music in a specific way and with a specific eye to things like accessibility and openness. And those values are very important to me. And I've never, maybe someday, I've not yet been able to really figure out my own best practices for making those things happen in my music. But when I think about writing and when I think about playing, and increasingly when I think about teaching, I'm thinking a lot about those artists and their values, which were informed by, yes, the political climate of the time, but also informed by their identity as Chileans and all of the things that that means from not only a political standpoint, but from a historical standpoint, from a heritage standpoint. And those things are somewhat related for me to being an American, but also the things that define me as an American are very different. And so these are the internal tensions, as well as I can describe them in this moment.
Yeah, so that's going to be a perfect segue into like our next question, which is about politically charged pieces. You've written like several like politically charged pieces in the past, and I have as well. So how do you go about walking the delicate balance between expressing yourself as an artist and getting your work performed? And someone asked me this question at Brevard when I was presenting my political piece over at a seminar once. Why do you think music is the best form to comment on social issues or political issues? Why not write an argumentative essay? Why not like donate money to like your some local organization? Why music? And I just want to know like your perspective on that question.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question, and I'll be straight up with you. I don't think music is the best form for political protest, not by a long shot. And concert music in particular, I think, is a bad, often, not always, but often a bad form of political protest because the audience for it is so limited. Now, that does not mean that it's valueless, right? You know, that doesn't mean that it's not worth writing political music. Political music, especially in the concert hall, often reaches a group of people with a certain amount of disposable income and social capital, and those people, by their own presence in the concert hall, are usually open-minded and wanting to encounter ideas beyond, not always, but often they're wanting to encounter ideas that are sort of beyond the scope that they have when they walk into the concert hall. So there is value in that. Is it the same value as donating to NARAL? No, it is not. But I don't think anyone who has ever written political protest music would say that it is. Ultimately, communities have to be created around political issues to pursue those political issues, and music can be a really meaningful part of that. Where that sort of delicate balance that you were talking about is concerned between like being honest with yourself politically and trying not to alienate people, trying not to get yourself on some sort of blacklist or something like that. I think generally, this is where having friends really becomes important. And sometimes having difficult conversations with your friends really becomes important, because ultimately, when I have written political music on the occasions that I have, I've written it for people who knew me and knew what they were getting themselves into. Because we'd had conversations that, yes, had a lot to do with music, but often also had to do with politics and had to do with my background, which, as we've talked about, is politically informed. And early on in the process, I would tell them, hey, this piece is about the healthcare industry, or, this piece is about information insecurity, or whatever it is, and they would say, oh my goodness, that's such a cool idea. And if they said, oh, I don't know. I don't know if this is the right project for you to take a political stance like that. I would have to talk to them about it, right? But that's a conversation to have early on in the process, while there's still time and creative energy in the tank to consider making some of those changes. That's never come up for me, but I think the reason it's never come up for me is because I try to approach all of my professional relationships with a certain amount of vulnerability. And I try to approach all my professional relationships as much as I can as friendships first. And if you're friends with someone, generally you can figure out where you agree and disagree, even on the tough stuff, even on politics. And that is a very important sort of prerequisite, I think, to writing political music that has a meaningful, cared for performance behind it. You know, in the grander scheme of things, in terms of like getting second, third, fourth performances, you know, I have not been nearly as political as some of my other colleagues have been. I think, and I, generally speaking, I consider myself to be a politically informed artist. I do not consider myself to be a political artist. And I think the distinction is really important, because when I have tried to address politics and sociology in my work, it's always been, I think, in these sort of very general ways that it's not that they're not designed to make people uncomfortable. It's that, to me, they are objects for debate rather than necessarily polemics, you know? And I think if you are a truly political artist and you are able to write polemics, you should, because there can be a lot of power in that. But ultimately, like, I feel like as an artist, I'm always kind of juggling too many spinning plates anyway, and trying to add one that's just hyper focused on politics. I just don't feel like I would make good art if I leaned too hard into making political music.
All right. Andy, do you want to move on to the fun questions, or?
These are fun questions. I'm having a blast. I'll talk about politics anytime.
Yeah. We have one more question in the dealing with criticism section if you want to take that one.
We can talk about it all. Let's air the laundry. Let's do it.
Okay, so you've mentioned at Brevard how your piece for Seven Percussionist Snake Oil has been falsely accused of cultural appropriation. So obviously that's a big issue. Where do you draw the line between respectfully borrowing elements from a culture and stealing it in a way that's offensive? And this question will obviously vary from person to person. I just want to know like your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, again, you know, as a Hispanic person who doesn't look Hispanic, this is something that I think about a lot, because eventually the day is going to come where I am going to utilize some Chilean something in my music that I feel entitled to, and someone is going to come along and tell me that I'm not entitled to it. And in my humble opinion, that person will be wrong, because it's my culture, it's my heritage, and nobody but me gets to define my relationship with it. Cultural appropriation, I think, is a messy topic, and I don't know that necessarily I would say I was falsely accused of cultural appropriation within Snake Oil, and what I will say is I don't consider Snake Oil to be a culturally appropriative piece. Yeah. You know, I do think that anytime you write for drums in a groovy, heavy 6/8 sort of way, there are certain associations that come along with that. You know, associations with African music, Afro-Cuban music, with Latin American music. But when I think about cultural appropriation, really what I think about is taking music that doesn't belong to me and presenting it as my own. And that in turn means that is not necessarily about the notes. It's about the cultural context of the music, right? If you're going to take for example, if you're going to write a tango, the thing that makes the tango is, yeah, there are certain rhythmic things associated with it. There are certain instrumentations associated with it. But the culture surrounding the tango has a very complex social and political history to it, involving all sorts of stuff, involving the working class of Buenos Aires, involving tension between various immigrant populations in the city and the upper class of the city. And understanding that history is really important to understanding the tango. And so if you're gonna write a tango, I am of the opinion that you can't discard that part of what the tango means. You can't just write dun 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 dun, which is not even a tango, really. It's a habanera. But like this is, to me, this is the soul of the question around cultural appropriation, right? Is like the tango is a thing that means something really, really important to a lot of people, and thus needs to be treated with respect. If you're going to write music that sounds vaguely Latin American, you can do it in a lot of, I think, nefarious ways that involve sort of recycling stereotypes and tropes or something like that. But if you're going to use Latin American rhythms, and you're going to use clave, and you're going to use the habanera or the tresillo or whatever, and you're not going to make claim to any of those cultures, there's not really culture that's being appropriated. There are musical ideas that are being claimed and reused, but if Andy is doing them in the context of his piece, as long as he doesn't call it Samba de Andy or something like that, it's not laying claim to a culture that doesn't belong to you. And it's not laying claim to a culture that you have not taken the time to study and make a part of yourself. Now, if you wanted to write Samba de Andy, you would have a lot of homework to do, I think. And you would need to understand what the samba means, what the sort of cultural place it plays, not only in Brazil, but in America is. And that's your job, I think, as the creative artist, is to have done that homework. But ultimately, it's about recognizing that when you move into the concert hall, there are cultures that cannot speak for themselves. When you move a tango or an African dance or a Chinese folk song into the concert hall, that is a culture that cannot speak for itself. And that then, for you as a creative artist that's using it, carries some responsibility with it. But that responsibility has much, much more to do with the understanding of the culture behind it than it does with the actual notes themselves. And that is my spiel about cultural appropriation.
I agree. It's like trying to understand what's behind the stuff you're writing, not just writing to put that label of whatever culture it is.
Right. Which also means that, it's not cultural appropriation simply to use a pentatonic scale. Right. It can carry with it a lot of nasty baggage. That baggage is context specific and is itself informed by the cultural associations that you, the artist, are encouraging me, the listener, to make. But a pentatonic scale is not itself a cultural artifact.
Right.
Yeah. It's a complicated issue. I mean, it's really, really cool to be talking to two high school musicians who are already thinking about it, because it's a really, really important thing for us to consider as creative artists.
Yeah, I think in my case, I have a commission to write like a well, it's like a Chinese folk song. So I guess in my case, it's not
Mhm.
appropriation because I am Chinese. But either way, I have to
Yeah.
do a lot of research on the stuff behind it since I don't really necessarily know that much about my culture either. So
Right. Well, and I think that's awesome. And I think what's really cool about that is it seems like you're using it as an opportunity to get more connected to your culture.
yeah, and like bring out my heritage, my family's.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think that's awesome.
I've kind of had like I don't know, in my music, a lot of it hasn't really like I haven't written that many pieces about like my identity, like
Uh-huh.
or like because like I mean I could talk about this for like a long time, but like
Mhm.
as like a Chinese person growing up in the United States, there are a bunch of like aspects of like I never like really tried I've never like really tried to incorporate like explicitly like Chinese elements
Sure.
into my music like
Mhm.
ever because of like the cultural connotations that come with it, and also because like I'm not very like well informed on that,
Yeah.
despite it being like kind of an integral element of my culture. um
I mean, do you feel compelled to? Do you feel like that's something you would want to explore in your work at some point?
I honestly don't really want to like, for the reasons that I mentioned before, I don't really want to
Mhm.
like get like too deep into the weeds with that.
Sure.
Um, but
I don't think that's required. Like, that's the nice thing. Like my heritage belongs to me. Your heritage belongs to you, and you get to do whatever you want with it. If you're listening on audio, I am holding a coffee cup. And this is my coffee cup, and I can drink coffee out of it, but the fact that I own it does not mean I am compelled to drink coffee out of it.
Right.
Right? I never have to use this coffee cup. I never have to engage with my tradition. And there may be valid reasons for me not to want to do that. There's this wonderful young composer, Nina Shekar, who is I don't want to get her heritage wrong. I believe she's Indian, but she said something on Facebook a while back that had to do with being approached as an artist of color, and as a young female artist to write. She gets commissioned all the time. And a lot of commissioners that she talks to are like, yeah, I really want to hear about your struggle as a minority. And she said, well, sometimes I don't want to write about my struggle. Sometimes I want to write about a farting unicorn or something like that. Like you as an artist, I think never have to engage with your tradition except to the extent that it is meaningful for you to do so. And that is a very personal thing. But like
Yeah.
if you, Andy, never wrote Chinese music, that would be, not only would that be okay, that would not at all play into your status as a Chinese American composer. Like you don't have to turn in your Chinese American composer card if you don't write that music.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like kind of the same way with like a lot of political issues. Like, I feel compelled to comment on them, yet I'm not really sure how. As like we talked about earlier, you said
Mhm.
how concert music isn't really the best way to like kind of like comment on social and political issues.
Mhm.
Yet I kind of do that anyway because like
Yeah.
honestly, I don't know any other like I don't feel like motivated. It's
Mhm.
not really that I don't know. It's just like don't feel like motivated enough to like actually like I don't know like donate to some local organization or
Yeah.
whatever.
Well, and it's important to, like, again, it's important to qualify that with, it's a valid way to talk about politics. I don't think it's the best way, but again, that doesn't mean that it's valueless, right? A microwave is not the best way to cook a steak. That doesn't mean it's not a useful cooking tool. Concert music, I think the reason I don't think it's the best way is because the audience is generally limited. The audience is generally consistent of people with a certain amount of disposable income coming from a certain social class. And it's hard to make, I think, really meaningful political music when the people who stand to be exposed to that political music are so limited even before the art reaches the stage, you know? But again, like we were talking about earlier, there's a lot of value in talking to that particular group of people that then goes out and has that social standing and that disposable income and has the ability to choose what they want to do with it, what causes they want to support, what issues are they thinking about when they go vote, or when they volunteer, or whatever. Like it's not it's not an all or nothing sort of thing, right? We can critique the infrastructure, and we can be honest about what it can and can't do, while being honest about what it can and can't do, right? Including what it can do, including the sort of political changes that it can affect, and that you as a composer of concert music are able to affect.
Yeah.
Like all of those things can be true simultaneously.
Yeah.
Okay, I think one that could be probably applied to more people is just ultimately there are going to be people that dislike your pieces, and some of them will be constructive, some might not be. So how do you deal with criticism as an artist?
Poorly. I think it's never fun, right? Like getting a bad review is not fun. Getting a bad review sucks. Finding out that someone who you wanted to like your piece did not like your piece is always emotionally difficult. And I think a couple of things have helped me. One is over time, if I'm being honest, developing just seething contempt for music criticism, to the point where like I'm just not going to read reviews of my work anymore. If people liked me, I assume they will tell me, and I don't need to read about whether they did or not. So like, choosing, and more to the point, choosing and being mindful about the places you look for validation is a really good starting point. No composer really needs to read their own reviews. It's a hard impulse to get away from, I think. But if you can do it, that helps a lot. When I have had people dislike my music, I think the thing that helps me, because it's never a useful strategy, I think, to say, oh, just don't think about it. Oh, just don't worry about that person, right? Like that just doesn't help. What for me helps is to use it as an opportunity to ask myself why I write music in the first place. Like, what is it that I really want to get out of it? What is it that I am really after as a creative artist? And I don't think the things that I want are tremendously different from anyone else who writes music. I would like my music to be heard. I want people to have an emotional reaction to it. And if I cared about the scale of those people, like if I cared about it being lots and lots of people or everybody, I would go be a pop songwriter. I wouldn't be writing concert music. I write concert music because I am more preoccupied with an intimate emotional connection. And that's the kind of thing that happens one-on-one. And I have a tremendous number of stories where someone has come up to me after a performance of my work and said, that was incredibly meaningful. I'm going to remember this performance forever. And, those moments to me are the things that I live in when I see someone criticizing my work. Are like, ultimately my goal was always to be meaningful, and that can be defined on a much smaller scale, right? And if you collect those moments, I think, as a creative artist, whoever you are, you collect those moments where someone says to you, oh my God, that was incredible, that was life-changing. And then you keep them safe, and when someone says something mean, you go back to them, and you just remind yourself that like that is the motivation, right? The motivation is not and was never for everybody to like you, because as you two said, it's not going to happen. No creative artist is universally adored, not a one. So, you know, that helps me is to focus on the small, meaningful difference that I have seen my music make for people, even individuals. And then, you know, beyond that, like we've been talking about, like I surround myself with people and friends who like what I do and think that it finds value. And if I find someone on the internet talking about how I'm, you know, derivative, or you know, my music is predictable, generally speaking, I can just, you know, mute them, block them, and move on. And my career is no worse for having done so.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, just to like not get lost in the criticism or like
Yeah. It's easier to talk about than I think it is to do, but you get practice at it, right? Like you exercise the muscle and eventually you get good at it.
All right, should we go on to the fun questions now?
Yeah.
Fun questions.
All right, Lucy, do you want to take the next one?
Sure. What is your favorite instrument to write for? Besides
Ooh.
trumpet, if it is trumpet.
Besides trumpet. Well, it's not trumpet. Without a doubt, tenor saxophone. For me, the most versatile, most wide range of expression on an instrument belongs to the tenor saxophone. You know, you hear what it can do in the classical realm, and it can be this beautiful, velvety, mournful thing. And then you hear John Coltrane, and it becomes this completely different thing. And you hear Michael Brecker, and it becomes this completely different thing. And then you go back to Tim McAllister, and it's a fourth thing altogether. And, you know, the saxophones, generally speaking, I think are incredible. But there's something about the tenor, because the tenor has such a haunting, beautiful sort of middle to low, but also because of the way it's constructed, it's got a lot more flexibility in the altissimo than some of the higher saxes do. So it can get this sort of anguished screaming, but also like exuberant, ecstatic quality to it. And not for nothing, but saxophonists are generally super fun to work with, and they're really, really excited to work with composers. So, you know, I love working with people. I love writing music for people, whatever instrument they play, but hands down, my favorite instrument to write for, tenor sax.
All right. That was kind of interesting to hear.
Yeah?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely wouldn't say something like the tenor sax, but like now that I think of it, it's like it's like a lot more versatile than I thought, as you said. So our next question is about your hobbies and interests outside of music.
Yeah.
If you'd like to share any of them with us.
Absolutely. Yeah. I do have a couple. You know, like I mentioned earlier, I play some video games. Right now I'm in the middle of playing through the Mass Effect trilogy. I've never played it. I'm enjoying it. I am a hockey fan, have been since grad school. My team is the San Jose Sharks, and as of this record, they are terrible. And you know, if you visit this recording in 5 years, they're probably still going to be terrible, but I'm still going to be cheering with my teal jersey all the way from Lincoln, Nebraska. At turns in my life have been a hiker, a baker. I am very, very occasionally a writer of short fiction, but my stuff is not good enough that I am comfortable sharing it with most people. You know, generally speaking, I think outside of hockey and video games, my hobbies all involve being creative and being outside. And that takes, you know, tons of different manifestations. Sometimes it's golf, or, you know, Frisbee. Sometimes it's writing, sometimes it's ceramics. You know, I nothing, nothing holds my attention for very long. So I'll usually go through phases where I'm like, I'm really into baking for 3 months, and then I won't bake anything for 5 years. And then, you know, I'll get my stand mixer out and I'll try to make a brioche or something like that. And it will be terrible, but it'll start me on baking again. And eventually, like 3 months later, I'm good at it. And then I put it away for another 5 years. You know, that kind of thing. Those are my hobbies generally, though.
That sounds like me. I'm always like doing random stuff for like 2 months and then I just stop forever.
Yeah. It's, I mean, it's a thing, right? Like you get to a certain point where you're just like, especially if it's in your free time, you're just like, I need something new. I need to move on to a different use of time.
Especially over quarantine. That was just
oh man,
random stuff every day.
Yeah, I've had pretty much the same experience as well.
Yeah. Yeah. What did you two get up to over quarantine? What were your quarantine hobbies?
Well, for me, it was also a lot of baking. I think we made tiramisu like 5 times. Like, sent them to different people. And then we got so sick of eating it because it just reminded us of quarantine.
Yeah, so now you have this like visceral reaction to tiramisu. Like, yeah.
Like PTSD from cake.
Yeah. For me, it was like attempting to teach myself how to program and how to cook, and failing again, and then attempting to teach myself again, and then failing again, and then just like looping into this endless cycle that
Did you
keeps
ever
on
get
going.
it? Did you
Kind
end
of.
up with like at the very least like one dish that you can cook well?
Kind of.
Kind of. What is it? What's
I
the
mean,
signature dish?
I would eat it, like but like I'm not sure any of you would like want to try it. It's literally just like the only thing I can cook is like eggs. Like
Everyone loves eggs. Eggs are
Yeah.
all
You know, if you can cook a good egg, you're gonna go far in this world.
Yeah.
Like that's a real important skill.
yeah, there's a lot of egg dishes out there.
Yeah. That's one of the reasons I can't cook is I do not handle eggs well. Like I'm terrible with eggs. So if you nailed that skill over quarantine, that was a quarantine well spent.
Yeah. I kind of did that. I would eat it. I don't know if you would eat it.
Well, next summer I'm gonna make you cook me an egg. I'm gonna bring you up to the cabin and be like, here's a hot plate. Go nuts.
Yeah, sure. All right. So I think our next question will be like really applicable for a lot of high school students who have to deal with time management. So
yeah.
you've mentioned that you're a trumpet player. How do you balance your practice time with the trumpet and time with writing music?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. The short answer is it's all about working smart, I think. You know, I feel like this could be an entire podcast, because I have this whole sort of elaborate time management strategy that involves certain approaches to creativity and things like that. But the uptick of it is, generally speaking, when I'm writing music, when I'm in the middle of a project, I'm writing for an hour and a half a day, not very much time. And when I am practicing and getting ready for a gig, I'm practicing for about an hour a day, not very much time. But for both of those things, I am working to maximize my return on investment for every minute that I'm putting into it. So when I'm composing, that means a variety of things. It means intelligent sketching. It means project organizing. It means, you know, putting my thoughts into a voice memo whenever I can, so that when I'm sitting down to write music, it's just like the pen is on the paper nonstop. For the horn, it means sort of being honest about what I need to have ready for the gig at hand. Like if I am about to play a lead gig, right? Like if I'm about to do a lead trumpet show, I am focusing on lip flexibility and lack of tension and things that will make it so that my high register is reliable and where I need it to be. And the other stuff is going to take a back seat. Because I just, at that time, I don't need to be working on my finger speed. you know. And if I'm going to have a solo gig coming up, I'm going to be working on my finger speed, and I'm going to be working on sort of like my improvisation chops, my ability to connect musical ideas to my fingers. And I'm probably not going to be worrying too much about doing calisthenics that will help me with my high register stuff. You know, I like, that's really what it comes down to, is I am practicing for the skill set that I need in the moment. And the disclaimer above all of that is, like, that's where I'm at in my career right now. And that's not necessarily how I was practicing when I was a student. When my priorities were very different, and I was trying to explore more things, and I was trying to do do a wider variety of performance types and things like that. At that point, my practice routine was a little bit different, but I still didn't do it too much, because I think after a certain point, like after 60 to 90 minutes of practicing, and this is pretty well documented, I don't think this is particularly controversial, you reach a point where you're not helping yourself. And in fact, you might, depending on the instrument, you might be causing yourself some pretty nasty physical harm. So I think, you know, if I were to distill this to some advice, everybody's mileage is going to vary with it, depending on your instrument, depending on the school of performance that you come from, depending on your approach to the instrument. But like, what I will tell my students is, if 60 to 90 minutes a day of practice is not enough for you to accomplish what you want to accomplish, it means something's wrong with your practice routine. It means that you need to rethink about the time you're spending in the practice room. And by extension, you know, get to a point with your practice where you can do it in that amount of time. And that can help with time management. That can also help with mental health, because, you know, let's face it, being in the practice room is stressful, and nobody wants to be in there for more than 90 minutes at a time.
Definitely. I think efficient practice, not just like practicing to practice a certain number of minutes, is really helpful. I've heard that advice.
Yeah.
For years.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Kind of going into like advice for, you know, high schoolers watching this podcast and just aspiring musicians, what advice do you have for students wanting to pursue music composition or just music in general in college?
Oh, if you want to pursue music composition, start writing and get performances of whatever you can. And it doesn't need to be the Philharmonic. It can be your buddy who plays a little bit of violin. And it can be done on a phone in a church. It does not have to be sterling in terms of quality. It's more about demonstrating that you care enough about your music to get it played and heard by real people. Now, if you want to major in music more generally, my best piece of advice is move fearlessly. Go into it. Don't worry too much about what you're going to do for a living on the other side, because even in a degree like music, there are thousands of different possibilities, not all of which are musical. I have friends with degrees in music that are doing some just unbelievably cool things that have nothing to do with music. A buddy of mine used to work for a major basketball team in their advanced stats department, and he did it on the strength of his degree in euphonium performance. You know, there's no straight line to the rest of your life after college. The most important thing is to be studying things that excite you and that you're willing to devote a lot of time and energy to getting better at and understanding more deeply. And at the end of your 4-year degree, if you can talk about the things that you've learned in a music major in a non-musical context, you can do anything you want with it. And like, the nice thing about a music major is that it teaches you a lot of things that are useful in a non-musical context. Like, if you two, Andy and Lucy, go to a 4-year degree program in composition, on the other side of it, yeah, you will know how to compose better. But like, as a consequence of spending all that time in composition, you will have learned project management, you will have learned public speaking, you will have learned system representation through the use of notation systems and things like that. You will have learned some pretty complex computer programming and digital tools through the use of the DAW and the notation software and all of that. And that's the beginning. You know, there are so many other skills that being a musician teaches you. And all of those things are skills that prepare you to move. I mean, they prepare you to move forward with a music degree, with a music profession, if that's what you want, but they also prepare you to move in all of these non-musical directions as well. So if you want to major in music, I would say my best advice is don't worry too much about what happens after your music degree. Just get there and work hard and be nice and make friends, and you will figure it out.
Yep,
Yeah,
that's excellent advice. So we're both composers, and we're both also applying to college soon. And
Yeah.
so what advice do you have for composers applying for college who are preparing a portfolio? And more specifically, how can young composers work to bring out their unique voice in that portfolio?
Yeah, excellent question. You know, every school is different, and the things that we're looking for in our program in Nebraska are different from the things that every other program is looking for, whether they're a major conservatory or a Big Ten like we are, or a small liberal arts college. Every program and every composition faculty is looking for something different. And you as the applicant don't really have a tremendous amount of control over what that thing is. So the best thing that you can be is yourself. And the best thing that you can be is honest about what that means. So, you know, I think there's this perception that at the undergraduate level, we're looking for people who think like graduate students and you know, present themselves as the master of the string orchestra. And so you get these portfolios that are full of, you know, 14 pieces for string orchestra that have never gotten played because there aren't that many string orchestras out there. And then the student comes to an interview and says, and we ask him, so have you ever thought about writing for anything other than string orchestra, like something that can get performed? And they have this deer in the headlights moment. And, you know, that's not usually, unless you're a very specific type of person, that's not the person you are, right? That's not the kind of musician you are. You, Andy, and you, Lucy, are both musicians that I think are more curious and diverse than that apocryphal person, right? So I'm eager, if I see an application from one or both of you, I'm eager to see a variety of things that, again, may not necessarily have the most polished performance, but preferably have a live one, and maybe are trying some different things out, you know, whether those things be instrumentation or whether those things be language. You know, my favorite student at Nebraska to talk about, or my favorite alumni of Nebraska to talk about, is a member now of a not surprisingly, a very successful bluegrass band. And he did his degree in composition with us. And the thing that he sent in as part of his application, he sent a couple of very basic sort of quote unquote compositions, you know, just scores for piano or piano and solo instruments, something like that. But the thing that got him into our program was the album that he had cut with his bluegrass band, for which he was the chief songwriter. And it displayed a tremendous amount of passion and creativity and drive to create meaningful music that was meaningful to him. And those are the things that we're looking for. We're looking for passion and creativity and drive to write music. And you can demonstrate those in 100,000 different ways. But very few of them involve necessarily fitting into one sort of hyper prescriptive compositional mold. I tend to think your best bet, like we're talking about, I tend to think your best bet if you're applying to a composition program generally is to be yourself and try to be yourself in as many different contexts as you can, right? And show what happens when you present for yourself a novel compositional problem. So you've got a great string quartet. Awesome. What can you do with a sax quartet? What can you do with a wind ensemble? What can you do with garage band, you know, and the sort of stock sounds that come out of it? Present as many different creative sides of yourself as you can, because that gives us the best ability to see those things that we are talking about, you know, creativity, passion, and drive. The more different sides of your creative personality we can see, the better we're going to be able to see those things.
Yeah, I think that's really awesome advice. Thank you so much, Dr. Simon, for being here with us today for episode 2 of ChordCast. I feel like we've talked so much from like the delicate balance of putting like political statements in your music to like favorite instruments to write for, to like, I don't know, something about cake. It's just like been like a big plethora of topics. And
yeah, this was a blast. I had so much fun talking to you guys.
Yeah, so thank you so much for your time, and make sure to tune in for episode 3 of ChordCast.